I know that some of you have visited the Ark Experience and the Creation Museum up in Kentucky, and I know that others of you are interested in that. The Ark Experience is something that I first heard about when I was doing my internship in Cherville. That church took their youth group up there every year, and so we were familiar with that. And the Ark Experience is a boat that is built according to the dimensions given in the book of Genesis for Noah's Ark. And it houses a museum about the account of Noah and the Ark. Now, the same company also has the Creation Museum, which is a museum about the biblical account of creation. And lots of people have visited these places, and they also produce educational materials that you can get that churches can use or whoever wants to use them. And they maintain websites with large amounts of information. And since so many people here have shown interest in those places, I thought it would be good to talk about them. Now, the Ark Experience and the Creation Museum are a part of something called the Creation Science Movement. They reflect the ideas of what is called creation science. And so really, I guess what we need to talk about is the creation science movement and see what that is. Now, I just read to you the account of creation from Genesis chapter 1. And from the beginning of Christianity up until about 150 years ago, that was the accepted account within the Christian world about how everything came into being. And that was just accepted until about 150 years ago. And then science came on the scene and said, well, we got news for you. That's not the way things came into being. And one of the things that science said is that life on earth was not created within the space of 2 or 3 days, the way Genesis says, but it gradually evolved over billions and billions of years. Now that, of course, is the theory of evolution. And although there was some resistance to evolution at first, eventually the great majority of Americans grew to accept evolution, including the great majority of Christians. But a number of Christians, though, especially in those early years, did not accept evolution. They continued to hold to the Genesis account of creation. And back around the 20th century, these people sort of more or less went on the offensive against evolution. And one of the ways they did that was to pass laws in certain states that forbade the teaching of evolution in public schools. Now, a number of states had those laws. North Carolina, though, by the way, did not. But these laws became the subject of national interest in 1925. It's like we talked about last week when a man named John Scotes, who was a teacher in Tennessee, he violated Tennessee's law against teaching evolution, and he got arrested and charged with a crime. And in a sensationalized trial, he was found guilty and fined $100. Now that verdict was later overturned on a technicality. The technicality being that the judge in that case did not have the authority to impose a fine that large. But that did not negate, of course, Tennessee's law against teaching evolution in public schools. And such laws remained on the books in many states for many, many years. The state of Arkansas had such a law, and it remained on the books until 1968, when the Arkansas Supreme Court struck it down. The Mississippi Supreme Court struck down Mississippi's law in 1970. And so until the late 60s, many states had laws that forbade the teaching of evolution in public schools. But those laws eventually all got struck down. And after these setbacks in the courts, it became obvious to those opposed to evolution that they were not going to be able to forbid the teaching of evolution in public schools. And so they changed their tactics. And that's when what's known as the creation science movement first began to garner public attention. It had started earlier in the 1960s, but it really got going in response to these court decisions that struck down the laws that prohibited the teaching of evolution. Now, creation science is opposed to evolution but it does not dispute the scientific evidence that is used to support evolution. Creation science takes the tack of saying, okay, we accept that this is the scientific evidence. However, we interpret it differently. The people that interpret it to get evolution interpret it this way. We interpret that same evidence differently. We take this evidence and we interpret it scientifically, and we can come up with scientific basis to believe the account of creation in the book of Genesis. And so creation science does not dispute things like fossils and the geologic record and dinosaurs and all. It just interprets them differently than evolution. It uses the same science. It just puts different interpretations on it. It says, here's the scientific evidence. And these people interpret it to support evolution, but it just as easily can be interpreted to support the biblical account of creation. And that's what the Creation Museum and the Ark Experience come out of. They take the various scientific facts which seem to point to evolution, and they say these can be interpreted a different way, and we can use them to support the biblical account of creation. They take the same scientific facts which seem to indicate the earth is billions and billions of years old and say, well, that's one way to interpret them, but this same science can be interpreted in a way to support that the earth is much younger. In other words, they're not rejecting the science. They're offering alternative explanations and alternative interpretations. Now, the original goal of the creation science movement was to have the views of creation science taught in public schools alongside evolution. A teacher would just say, okay, here are the facts, and here's one way to interpret them, that's evolution, and here's another way to interpret them, and that's creation science. But remember, in the late 1960s, the courts had struck down all these state laws that were trying to prohibit the teaching of evolution, and they did that because they said that the reason these states were prohibiting evolution was because they were trying to promote a certain religion, and said that was unconstitutional for the government or government agency like the public school system to promote any certain religion. And so the advocates of creation science said, well, our views should not be seen as promoting any certain religion because we're really not talking about religion. We're talking about science. Our views are based on science. Here's the scientific evidence. Here's the scientific interpretations that we use. It's all science. It's not religion at all. In their minds, they were not talking about religion. They were just putting forth a different interpretation of the scientific evidence. Some states went along with this and they passed laws that mandated teaching creation science alongside evolution. These states agreed that creation science was not religion, it was science. It was just an alternative interpretation of the scientific evidence. It wasn't the government mandating promoting any certain religion. It was just the government mandating the teaching of different interpretations of science. But those laws were also challenged in court, and they were struck down. Arkansas's law was struck down in 1982. Louisiana's law was struck down by the United States Supreme Court in 1987. And basically, the court said that creation science is not really science. The courts held that true science is the science that supports evolution, and basically the courts held that evolution is truth, and from that it follows that anything that challenges evolution must not really be science. And the courts struck down all these state laws holding that creation science was just a backdoor attempt to teach the biblical account of creation in public schools. And this was basically the end of the movement to have creation science taught in public schools alongside evolution. creation science then moved outside the realm of public education and into the private arena. And that's when things like the Ark Experience and the Creation Museum started coming into existence. They could not teach it in the public schools, but they could develop their own avenues for promoting the ideas, and that's what they did. However, as far as public education is concerned, those who held to the biblical account of creation saw themselves in a bind. Here they were sending their children to the public schools, and they were paying taxes to support the public schools, but the public schools were teaching their children something that they felt was diametrically opposed to the Bible. In their minds, the public schools were poisoning their children's minds against the Bible. You see, if you want to raise your children believing that the Bible is true, including the account of creation, you can understand how you would not want your child to go to school and be taught that the Bible is not true, especially when you're paying taxes to support the schools. And so the public schools were, in essence, teaching children that the Bible is not true. And that, in the minds of many parents who believed the creation account from Genesis was a violation of the free exercise of religion, and that the state was inserting itself into religion, not promoting a certain religion, but doing the opposite. The state was inserting itself into religion by teaching students in public schools that the Bible is not true. Now, these were the arguments that the advocates for creation science made. The courts rejected that. And the courts maintained that evolution is truth. And if that truth goes against any certain religion, then so be it. Now, many parents who rejected evolution gave up the fight at that point. They began either sending their children to religious schools or homeschooling their children. Homeschooling has exploded over the past 20 years. I looked this up from the state of North Carolina itself. And here's what they say. In 1999, there were about 3,200 children homeschooled in the state of North Carolina. 20 years later, in the year 2019, there were 1,600 students homeschooled in Cleveland County alone, and 150,000 in North Carolina in 2019. That's an increase from 3,200 to 150,000 in 20 years. And there is a similar increase in the number of children being sent to religious schools. A lot of parents are giving up on the public school system, obviously, but not all. Some proponents of the biblical account of creation didn't give up. They turned to something else. They turned to something called intelligent design. Now, intelligent design, just like creation science, depends on science, but in a different way. Instead of offering alternative explanations of the scientific evidence like creation science does, intelligent design attempts to use science to prove that certain aspects of the world and certain aspects of living things cannot be fully explained by evolution and natural selection. It points out things evolution cannot explain, things like the structure of DNA, intelligence, and the development of language. There are also other things evolution cannot explain, such as why human beings sunburn. You know, if you're supposed to evolve, you wouldn't sunburn. And why human beings don't have fur on them, why we have to wear clothes. Those things seem to be opposite from what you would expect from evolution. And from there, intelligent design goes on to say that since evolution and natural selection cannot explain all these things, then there must be some force behind it, some intelligence behind the universe. That's where the name intelligent design comes from. The idea that since there are things that evolution and natural selection cannot explain, they must have been designed by some rational, intelligent entity. And that rational, intelligent entity, of course, would be God, or gods, plural, depending on which way you lean in your religion. So intelligent design does not necessarily promote the teaching of the biblical account of creation, but it does favor pointing out the flaws in evolution, the things evolution cannot explain, and from there, of course, people can draw their own conclusions. Now, some school boards in various states adopted measures that mandated the teaching of intelligent design alongside evolution. Instead of just teaching evolution is 100% fact, ironclad, evolution would be taught, and then the flaws of evolution would be pointed out, the things evolution cannot explain. Now, the school board in the town of Dover, Pennsylvania had passed such a measure, and they were doing that, and they got sued. And the suit claimed that intelligent design was not science at all, but it was a backdoor attempt at teaching the Bible in public schools. And in 2005, a judge agreed and struck that measure down, and that put a damper on other school boards across the nation and effectively ended the efforts to have intelligent design taught in public schools. So all this came about from efforts to either prohibit the teaching of evolution in public schools or require the teaching of alternative ideas to education. Now, the first one we looked at was the creation science movement. That's what the Ark experience and the Creation Museum come out of. They're no longer able to, they no longer really try to get their ideas taught in public school. They've more or less given up on that, so they've just developed other avenues to get their ideas out there. So both movements failed in getting their ideas taught in public schools. Both movements failed in mandating something other than evolution be taught. So both of them failed. It's interesting, though, to look at them a little closer. Both used the same tactic. Both used science to prove the validity of their position. And of course, both were challenged in court. In the court cases that challenged them, the issue was not whether it was constitutional to teach the creation account in public school. That was a settled question, and no one thought they could win on that question. The question the judges were called to decide was, what constitutes science? You see, both creation science and intelligent design said their positions were based on science. That's what they argued when they went to court. They did not go to court and argue that the public schools should teach the biblical account of creation. They argued that their positions were validated by science. And so the whole thing was not a religious question at all. It was a scientific question. That's what they argued. Now, if you just think about that for a minute, what does that do? It gives the impression that both the creation science movement and the intelligent design movement accept science as ultimate truth. They didn't go to court and say, our position's true because that's what the Bible says. They went to court and they said, our position is true because we can back it up by science. And by doing that, they were taking the exact same position that those who accept evolution take. That science is what tells us the real truth. By their arguments, they were in effect agreeing that science is where we find truth. I remember a number of years ago, something called the Shroud of Turin was being talked about a lot. Some of y'all may remember that. That's a piece of cloth on which some people say there is an image of a body imprinted there. And some people believe the Shroud of Turin is the grave cloth that Jesus' dead body was wrapped up in before it was laid in the tomb. And the image imprinted on that cloth is supposedly the image of Jesus' body. And that was supposedly made on there by some kind of energy field when Jesus rose from the dead. So this piece of cloth has been subjected to various tests. So far, no one has been able to conclusively prove exactly how old it is, exactly what these impressions are, or how they got there. But there are many people who believe that it is the cloth Jesus was buried in, and that these impressions are of Jesus' own body, made by some sort of energy field when he resurrected from the grave. And I remember back years ago when that was being talked about so much, and I remember one of the reasons people were so excited about it and wanted it to be true is that they said, if we can prove this to be true, then we'll have scientific proof of the resurrection of Jesus. We'll have scientific proof of the truth of the gospel. We'll have scientific proof of the truth of Christianity. It's the same logic that creation science and intelligent design use. Here's scientific proof of the truth of the Bible. But what does that really say? Think about that now. If I have science over here and the Bible over here, and I say you should believe the Bible because I can prove it by science, what am I really holding up to be the number one truth? I'm holding science to be the number one truth. What I'm really saying is you know the Bible is true because science proves it, but if you are proving the Bible by science, then you're really saying that science is the standard that measures truth. Science is the yardstick of truth. What lines up with this right here is what is true. How do I know this Bible is true? Because it lines up with this. Therefore, this is my yardstick. This is my measure. This is what I put number one. And that's what creation science, intelligent design, the Ark experience, the Creation Museum, and the Shroud of Turin really do. They place science in the number one position as the standard of truth. Why did the creation science movement fail and the intelligent design movement fail? They surrendered before they ever got started fighting. You see, they surrendered because they basically accepted what the evolutionists were saying, that science is where we find truth. That's the very point, though, they should have been fighting over. They didn't fight over that point, though. They surrendered that point. They surrendered the most important point, and then they went on to fight about things that didn't really matter. Even if creation science and intelligent design had won and had gotten their ideas taught in the public schools, there would be no real difference in what children are being taught. Children today are being taught in the public schools that science is where you find real truth, and that science is the only place you find real truth. And that's the exact same thing that creation science and intelligent design would have been teaching them, because they too use science as the yardstick by which truth is measured. You see, victory does not come from being on the defensive. Victory comes from being on the offense. Instead of holding science up as the truth above all truths, and instead of either backing down from the Bible where it doesn't agree with science or trying to use science to prove the Bible, Christians could have simply said, this is my standard of truth, and you may have this over here. I'm not changing this to make this agree with this. You change yours to make yours agree with mine. Now that's being on the defensive, and that's the way to win. I'm not changing. You change yours to make yours agree with mine. You cannot fight against an idea by accepting the basic premise of that idea and then just fighting against certain specific manifestations of that idea. You have to fight against the idea as a whole. The problem never was evolution. The problem never was the age of the earth. The problem never was creation versus the Big Bang or any of that stuff. That's never been the problem. The problem was and is that science is the yardstick by which real truth is measured. That's the problem. That idea is the problem. But nobody fought against that idea. They surrendered that idea and only fought against derivatives to it. And so that idea won. That science is the yardstick by which real truth is measured, it won not only in society, but it won also in most versions of Christianity today also. Why is this so important? Because science does not deal with the way things really are. It deals with appearances and with the way things seem to be. Christianity, however, does not deal with appearances. It does not deal with the way things seem to be. It deals with the way things actually are. Remember a long time ago when we looked at the conception of truth in Christianity, and we saw how that Greek word in Christianity that means truth has the connotation of something being unveiled, the cover being taken off so you can see behind it. And we saw that in Christianity, we believe that truth is hidden under a veil of appearance. And only when that veil of appearance is lifted can we see truth. Appearance, in other words, is misleading. You see, science never gets beyond the veil of appearance. But Christianity is what takes the veil off and allows us to see truth. That's why it's so important. If we want to continue to be fooled by appearance, or if we want to allow the veil to be taken off and see truth. Christianity shines the light on the truth.